feels like every week we pass another anniversary of something we barely knew we were supposed to be remembering in the first place, but this past Friday something went by that I'm surprised didn't get more national attention in the US outside of Chicago, Illinois. July 12th, the 40th anniversary of the so-called disco demolition riots. Now you may have heard of this particular event in passing, depending on your age and interest in the history of American popular music, but for a while it was one of, if not the great cautionary tales of fandom gone wrong, or at least out of control. The short version is that on July 12th, 1979, the promoters of a doubleheader baseball game between the Chicago White Sox and Detroit Tigers at Chicago's Comiskey Park had arranged a between-game event with Steve Dahl, the DJ of a popular local rock radio station, titled Disco Demolition, wherein a large box filled with disco albums donated for this purpose by attendees would come to be blown up with explosives by Dahl and his crew, who'd cultivated a comedy persona around the gimmick of being purist rock and roll fans at war with the disco trend in popular culture. Okay, so I've talked about the complicated history of how the disco era is remembered by history before in the Dazzler movie episode, but basically what we now remember as the disco trend started out as American underground club DJs in the 70s playing imported semi-obscure dance music, sometimes in new arrangements, and then new music inspired by that same that became the default soundtrack of the urban metropolitan club scene, particularly in minority neighborhoods and the gay nightlife scene. And then, you know what, I'm just gonna play the Dazzler episode clip.
Modern popular culture remembers the disco moment and its subsequent crack-up as a kind of weird fever dream, but the whole sweep of it was much more about a point where this specific music and dance genre came to be identified as the symbolic nexus point for a very rapid push into the cultural mainstream of aesthetic elements borrowed from gay and black urban metropolitan subcultures that crashed hard against a backlash supercharged by the confluence of the AIDS crisis and economic downturn and the rise of Reaganism in the moral majority. We mostly remember the disco sucks blowback now as a culture collectively getting tired of tacky clothes and the cheesy mainstream side of the disco genre because it's easier than accepting the ensuing decades' cultural complicity in the homophobia, racism, and bordering on genocidal callous disregard of the HIV epidemic that were in reality inextricably bound to the general rightward tilt of late 70s, early 80s pop paradigm, but that's another show.
Okay, so basically once celebrities got big into the club scene, a streamlined, watered-down version of this musical experimentalism, generalized as disco, became a huge, mega-profitable fad as a way for the mainstream, read middle-class white people of America to nibble at the edges of the counterculture without feeling too kinky about it. A certain percentage of traditional rock radio stations and analog musicians felt financially stung by the trend and publicly lashed out about it, which got conflated with media perception of disco as a gay, liberal, foreign, black, Latin, etc. genre invading white spaces, and the general conservative backlash wave that was about to land in the 80s, and it's easy to see why something like Disco Demolition could have been the spark that turned all that gas into an explosion, even if there wasn't necessarily an explicit connection between a resurgent cultural racist streak and a dumb radio stunt in Chicago. In any case, at the actual event, even before Dahl got to blow up his box, it turned out too many fans had shown up, and there were too many records, depending on who you ask. This was in part because some had brought not only disco albums, but also R&B, soul music by black and Latino artists in general, or rock albums by artists who'd express leftist politics, so people had started throwing them from the stands like frisbees during the first game. When the explosion actually went off during the changeover, it was larger than expected, and waves of fans decided to rush the field and began trashing and looting the stadium, ultimately causing the second game to be forfeited as riot police had to be called into the stadium. The whole debacle made national news, international news really, characterized in Rolling Stone magazine as your paranoid fantasy about where the ethnic cleansing of rock radio could ultimately lead, and later compared to a Nazi book burning by legendary music producer and chic guitarist Nile Rodgers. So why is this on my mind? I mean, other than that we just passed the actual anniversary, obviously. Well, partly it's because a story about fans and fandom not behaving themselves, and it's Comic-Con week, so we're going to be hearing a lot about that kind of thing, but it's also a story about how the effects of such things can actually carry. See, with the disco genre already plateauing around 1979 and receding from sales dominance over the next few years, with artists like Michael Jackson and Donna Summer's labels rebranding them as pop or dance music even as their sound effectively didn't change at first, to this day, the disco demolition riots and the ugly attitudes associated with it are often framed as a flashpoint that not only killed a music genre, but perhaps helped kickstart a hard-right backlash cultural domino effect that would effectively include the rise of the moral majority and Reaganism in America, a framing that continues to this day. When the White Sox this past year decided to mark the anniversary last month by selling cheeky commemorative t-shirts and having Steve Dahl throw out the first pitch, the event was met with public outrage in some quarters due to the organization not only making no mention of how the history had come to be viewed by some, but also hosting the commemoration early during Pride Month. Now, to be clear, that definitely feels like no small amount of insensitivity at play, but I myself have always been a bit skeptical of the idea that disco demolition itself was a catalyst without which the ensuing backlash culture of the early 80s would either have not happened at all or taken a significantly different form. To be a bit on the tenuous side, it certainly makes dramatic narrative sense, as in if you were making a movie about the rise and fall of the disco era and you needed a big symbolic moment to say this right here is where things went off the rails, like the way Boogie Nights transitioned from the 70s to the 80s. sure, you'd use that, but it feels to me more like this was something that came out of backlash culture and not the other way around. Now, that isn't to say that rowdy, angry, overly invested in the wrong way fans of music or sports or comics or whatever aren't a bad thing or part of the problem or deserve some kind of absolution for their part in these matters, but sometimes I do think that because they're the most visible, easily contextualized, and reachable on the ground part of negative cultural waves, there's a temptation to make them the focus of the blame rather than the bigger, harder to grasp and therefore fight forces that actually drive these things. And what that reminds me of in contemporary fan culture are phenomenons like the near-constant conflation of the famously embarrassing retake Mass Effect tantrum, wherein video game fans circa 2012 got very angry about the ending of Mass Effect 3 and launched what was kind of offensively referred to as a protest campaign against the developers to urge them to change it or offer some kind of reassuring footnote, with pretty much every video game and nerd culture controversy that came after. See, this unprecedented outrage was eventually seen as somewhat successful in its goal and has frequently been cited as some kind of origin story for every fans behaving badly news item that's cropped up in the world of gaming since, be it threats and stalking against female developers or journalists, manufactured outrage about character designs, and even broader nerd culture happenings like the explosion of manufactured outrage against Star Wars producer Kathleen Kennedy, the Captain Marvel franchise, or the rise of internet alt-right in general, all of which seemingly suggest that you could perhaps draw a straight line from BioWare saying, okay, fine, here's some bonus content, it'll shut you up, to yeah, several years later, and I don't know about that. Don't misunderstand me, bad fandom is a problem, and fans should always try to be better, certainly, but it's important to remember that the majority of fandom itself is a reactive, reflective thing. It responds to the world much more than it shapes it, so instead of looking back on things like Disco Demolition or any of our current embarrassments as the starting point of bad happenings to come, maybe it's better to try and see them as evidence of bad happenings that are already underway. Well, there's still time for us to recognize it and do something about it.